Hey everyone, it's Professor Somo here. So today I'm going to present to you a little mini lecture to help highlight and elaborate on some of the main ideas from Chapter 9 of Joel Best's book, which is on policy outcomes for this chapter. This chapter focuses on the reactions that people have once the social problems workers that we learned about in Chapter 8 have actually implemented the policies that have been passed, and we'll also be looking at what some of the possible policy outcomes are from that point forward. So let's get started. So a little bit about the overview. Please remember to do the Chapter 9 IRAT by this Friday. We're going to have a quick mini lecture on policy outcomes and new claims, and then on our discussion forum, we're going to have an activity on there, and then more mini lecture on policy critics, evaluating policy, and policy debates. Let's do this. All right, policy outcomes. So the first thing to keep in mind is that a policy outcome is essentially what has happened now that the social problems workers have actually implemented those policies that have been passed, and what reactions do people have basically now that we've had some time to sort of see what has happened with this policy. And how are people feeling about it? So in general, there are, common reactions and then not so common. Let's do the not so common reactions first. Generally, it's very rare for people to feel complete happiness about the policy and how it's working. On the other hand, it's also rare for us to feel complete rejection of the policy and how it's working. In fact, most of us instead actually just realize that the troubling condition is not ending after all, even though a policy has been passed. And so we generally have a few different reactions to that, right? So after we've realized like, oh darn, the policy that we passed on homelessness isn't ending homelessness, generally what we decide to do from there is to refine the policy, right? So we go back, look at that policy that was passed and see if there are ways in which that we can improve the policy now that we've had an opportunity to test drive it, right? Give it a little test run, see how it works, and now to make some changes that will help us relieve the troubling condition even more. Again, it may not end it, but the goal is to consistently work on improving the troubling conditions in our society. Sometimes also what happens as a result of us realizing that this troubling condition hasn't ended is that we understand that there are often multiple causes that are contributing to a troubling condition, and it's not just one thing that's happened that we can have a silver bullet for and fix, right? And so what that means is that we recognize that the one policy that we've passed, or even the few policies that we've passed, are not enough on their own to end it or perhaps to make the drastic changes that we'd like. And so as a result, what happens then is that new claims are created. And so we create these new claims based on the evaluation of the policy or policies that have already been passed. And we've, seen some of the outcomes from them. And so generally there are, some policy criticisms that fall under several broad categories for us to consider, right? And so generally people will either say, oh, the policy was insufficient to solve the problem. And so then we're like, okay, so more needs to be done. And it could be that either the original policy was aimed too narrowly in order to gain support. Another option sometimes is that the policy was perhaps excessive. Or such as like maybe the policy was actually overly broad. Maybe it had the opposite problem. Instead of being narrow, it was overly broad. And so if it's overly broad, what we need to do to make it better is to limit it in some ways or maybe even many ways in order for the policy to become much more successful. Another possibility is that we believe that the policy was misguided. So sometimes people say, hey, the policy didn't solve the condition for which it was created for because it was misguided. The condition is real, but maybe the policy was not successful at eradicating or at least alleviating the troubling condition. In other instances, sometimes the policy may make things worse. And generally at the implementational level now with these social problems workers, sometimes people say, oh, the social problems workers are not meeting the initial purpose of the claims makers. And so that might be one of our criticisms. So let's look at who tends to be policymakers in a moment. But before we jump in there, just wanted to quickly plug in our discussion forum for the week. Basically, what we're going to do is look at the policy that we wrote about in homework 8 and basically ask ourselves a couple of questions, right? So are there new claims being made about the policy or the troubling condition? And under what category does the criticism fall under? And so we'll revisit that in our discussion forum together. So let's get back to who tends to be policy critics. So generally people who are critiquing these policies fall under, roughly 4 different categories. The first is social problems workers. And they tend to critique policies because they know the policy the most intimately, and therefore they're often the most ambivalent about its implementation because they're really our frontline workers. Our other policy critics tend to be the subjects of the policy because they are the ones who on a daily basis feel the frustrations and perceived inadequacies of the policy, and they hope to make it better because of course it directly impacts them. The third tends to be original claims makers because they know what the original vision was and they can see how the policy didn't actually fulfill their vision. Sometimes after a policy has been originally envisioned, it's been changed so many times by the time that it passes that it's not always necessarily what the original claims maker had in mind. And then, of course, our counter claims makers, whether they are primary or secondary claims makers, sometimes if they disliked the original claims and the policy and they want to overturn them, see this as sort of their opportunity to get in there and perhaps pass a different type of policy to support their counterclaim. So let's dive into evaluating policy for a little bit. Who tends to be the best evaluators? And so there's this debate on, who's better? Is it better to have an outsider to the social problems process, or is it better to have an insider to the social problems process? Well, let's look at the methods, right? So generally the methods of evaluation that are used in policy studies tend to either be experiments, which are actually rarely used. Experiments are rarely used to measure effectiveness. So usually it's more non-experimental studies that we more commonly use. And so what we'll generally do is evaluate across 2 or more times. So we'll look at, okay, when the policy existed, how was the troubling condition? And when it didn't, how was the troubling condition? And then compare those against each other. Sometimes we will also evaluate across place. And so we'll look at whether location affects the policy. So sometimes one place would have the policy and another would not. But of course, if we're going to do something like that, then we want to try to hold the population as constant as possible so that we can compare apples to apples, so to speak. Generally, we use whatever kinds of data are available, and we're not necessarily sure that they're generated in what we would consider acceptable social scientific ways. And so as a result, this raises some methodological concerns for us. So sometimes we're wondering about the quality of the evidence available for analysis. We're, of course, aware of the constraints, right? So there's constraints on what can be gathered because of confidentiality issues and so on and so forth. We're sometimes concerned of the accuracy of the records or the consistency of the record collection and the procedures that surround those. Other times, we are worried about bias in evaluators, especially if they are internal to the social problems process. And so, we really ask ourselves, what is the choice of the method we want to use for evaluation? And is that method that we want to use for evaluation, is it the best for that particular situation? Know that sometimes special groups are created just for policy evaluation in order to be more credible to the process, right? And so generally, we're talking about like national commissions or state and local commissions, for example. Or appellate courts might be asked to be policy evaluators and sometimes even to rule on whether something is constitutionally acceptable or not. Sometimes they're asked to limit policy in a number of ways, or they're, given some implementation timetables, or there's a range of people that the policy affects, and so they're brought in. A really common example that we think of when we think of evaluating policy is the 9/11 Commission report. Basically, because the FBI and CIA did not communicate their intelligence regarding the events leading up to 9/11, we basically had a special group created in order to evaluate all of the evidence that was available so that there was the most impartial sort of investigation and reporting on it as possible. And that's so, so, so important. Of course, our policy debates, generally center on ideology, right? Now, what's wonderful about that is that it's helpful for us to separate into, sides that make sense to us and therefore allow us to understand different sides of things better. Yet at the same time, the issue with that also is that we have very predictable sides that tend to emerge, right? And so generally people will refer to this as, a leftist side or a rightist side. And so on the leftist side, a leftist ideology generally stresses, equality and concerns about discrimination and the need for encouraging equality more in our society and equity. And the rightist ideology generally tends to stress liberty and order. And so know that as a result of these various interests, the ideologies really start to kind of emerge and appear as incredibly divisive. So before I let you go, some really quick reminders to continue submitting your homework, including homeworks 8 and 9 when you can. Also to do IRAT number 10 by next Friday. And to also bring your notes on chapter 10 for our in-class TRAT that day. This is our very last chapter, folks. And so this will also be our very last IRAT as a result and our very last TRAT too. And so I greatly look forward to finishing up the semester with all of you. Thank you so much. Take care till next time. Bye.